Welcome to this session on open letters on open access. My name is John Dove, and I've come to Charleston now since 2004. It was just 1 year in 2011 when I had to make a decision. Let's see, Charleston or brain surgery, which luckily brain surgery was okay, and I'm here again. I might not be here. But indeed, I'm really delighted to be able to present this along with Ingrid Becker, this project on open letters on open access. So Ingrid and I worked together at Credo Reference in between her getting a master's in English literature at Oxford, and then worked for Credo for a couple of years, and then went and now is in her penultimate, or last year, of a 6-year PhD program at the University of Chicago in English literature. So I think she's going to get it down pat. So in December last year, she came to me and said, John, there's a possibility the University of Chicago has these global impact grants that they offer their penultimate summer. You get to, before you get your PhD, you can get a grant to do some work for a nonprofit. And you have an open access project that you could do, so that we could do together. I said, oh, absolutely. So indeed, we sat down and thought about it, and we decided we needed a project that would use her skills as an emerging scholar in English literature, and would use my skills at being able to network, and it had to be no technical risk. We couldn't be building something and seeing if it worked, and then seeing if the requirements were right, and see if users liked it. So this, we could have built a website or other things. No, this had to be a project with no technical risk. And in the world of open access, it's very much the whole question of how do you communicate with academics about open access.
Which, of course, really resonated with me as a fledgling academic, as John spoke to me about some of his aims to reach academic authors and get them interested in open access, and how in many ways it seemed like a no-brainer that I would want my work open, for instance. But I realized I had no idea about any of this. I was really unaware of this entire and crucial apparatus of, the inner workings of scholarly publishing. The words institutional repository had never come together in my vocabulary or the vocabularies of my peers. And so we thought that we wanted to direct this project, which we also enlisted Sam Klein.
So Sam Klein was a great collaborator for this. He's actually famous for the One Laptop Per Child project that went around about 20 years ago. And then he's an associate with the Berkman Klein Center on Internet and Society at Harvard University, which is where Peter Suber is an affiliate, and Les Sabin, a whole lot of famous luminaries. And Sam is, he's on the board of the Wikimedia Foundation, which is where I first met him at a Wikimania. So what he brought to the table is not only a lot of really interesting ideas, but he has a nonprofit that was able to be the source, the administrative part of this. The nonprofit is called Impact Hub. And Impact Hub, hold on a second. It is called Pattern Labs. There we go. I'm just a little bit of a tongue twister here. So Pattern Labs is the idea of being able to develop something that then becomes a pattern for others. And it scales up by simply replicating.
Yeah.
So that gave us the whole structure of, if we do a project, we should document it well, document our decision points, and be able to have other people look at what we did, and they don't have to follow exactly what we did, but they can modify it based on their decisions. So.
Yeah, exactly. So we have a few months, a small summer project, and we wanted to try and figure out how to make something replicable that tried to get through this major hurdle to adoption of open access amongst academics, which has been cited by many people, including Peter Suber in his book on open access.
Yeah, if you haven't read this book lately, or if you haven't read it all, you've really got to read it if you want to know open access. Peter's the parliamentarian of open access. He left his academic career to devote his full time and energy to open access. And so he was one of the people at the Budapest Open Access meeting in 2002, and he's like the parliamentarian of open access. He's both a lawyer and a philosopher, so he's really clear in his writing. Yeah. And this question of misunderstanding, it actually came up at the Berlin 13 conference, which is the 13th, it wasn't 13 years, it was the 13th subsequent conference based on the first one, which was the Berlin Declaration, which is one of the three major meetings about open access. And at that meeting, they started off reading this quote from Peter's preface. The largest obstacle to OA is misunderstanding. The largest cause of the misunderstanding is lack of familiarity. And the largest cause of infamiliarity is preoccupation. I don't know if you are involved in conversation with academics, but does that resonate with you?
Yeah. Yes.
Yes,
They're busy.
exactly.
And do they need to have a whole explanation of the 10 degrees of open and, no, they're busy. That's certainly true of academics I know, so.
Yeah, exactly. And sorry, this is obscured, apologies, because a last minute transfer from Google Slides to PowerPoint. But this other statistic that closed that presentation was another based off a survey, and the understanding of OA, librarians 89, administrators 54, and this third number is 32%.
You know, these are European numbers. It was a consortium of European universities last year, so my guess is that actually in America the figure would be a little bit lower.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, but indeed the biggest opportunity for education is the academics. Because they have by far the lowest understanding of open access. And I'm not academic myself. It took me 26 years to finish Oberlin. I dropped out of college to join this startup on Wall Street. My mother said, "Oh, John, what are we going to tell the family? We thought you'd do something useful with your life." So I paid amends. She didn't live long enough to see me come to the Charleston conference. But the academics are all over my family, so it's like, I know what their situation is like, and half the things they know for a fact about open access isn't true. Even though they are sharing people. So
Yeah.
it resonated with me, and if we could figure out a way to reach them, that would be super.
Yes. And part of what we're here to do today is both to tell you about our project, but also we wanted to sort of take a minute to see what you all have had experienced in terms of academics that you may have worked with. What do they understand least? Where are the sort of
particularly
target
about
points?
stuff they've already published, because we would be dealing with stuff that's already published. So what is it that academics in your world least understand about open access as related to their already published works?
Yeah.
Why they can't post a scan of a commercially published article on SSRN?
Well, they can, but the question is, should they?
Yeah.
Well, they can't because they're asking me to do it for them.
Oh, yes. David?
Well, copyright implications, which is directly related to what he was just talking about. Yeah, the copyright issues are things they not only don't know about, but they don't want to know about.
Yeah, very much. Anybody else? Well, I tell you, yes,
Yeah, why can't we?
was that?
Why can't you? What do they understand least about sharing? Why aren't you allowed? Why should you not be allowed?
Yeah, no, and the opposite is one of the big ones. They don't know they're allowed to. They think they're not allowed to. And it's true of many of my son's colleagues where he teaches American Studies. They don't think they're allowed to. And in fact, 81% of scholarly publishers acknowledge that authors can share some version of their author-accepted manuscript. And when I bring it up in different meetings, often people will say, "Oh, well, not my publisher." But all the big ones, Elsevier, Wiley, Taylor and Francis, almost anyone you could name, is one of those 81%. And it rises. When I first started in this open access world, it was 78%, so it keeps rising. So
Are there any other sort of categories or examples? I mean, one that I encountered, which is a little bit different, and especially coming from the humanities, was a fear of open access in terms of what it means for anyone to be able to see your work. So rather than I want to share but I can't, or I'm not allowed to share but the copyright's too complicated, but also I'm going to lose control, especially for an early career researcher, right, of this thing that I've worked months and months on. And so that's another one, I think, that depending on your field can arise.
well, didn't you say that one of your colleagues actually said, well, to another colleague, oh, make sure you don't put that in the repository because then everybody can read it.
Yes, exactly, exactly.
Yeah.
And this was a dissertation filing, so she also didn't want everyone to see it before it wasn't ready, of course.
Yeah,
It was gonna, you know, but
So,
yeah, so here are a couple, we had collected anecdotally and in terms of researching a variety of these issues. You know, we touched on several of them, policies, the difference between versions of postprint and preprint, author-accepted manuscript. OA policies also we didn't even touch on, but making sure that academics are compliant with funding policies and institutional policies. So for the next sort of 20 minutes or so, and then we'll have Q&A, we're going to walk you through a little bit about what we did for our project, with the goal that you can walk away out of this room and possibly, hopefully, find something replicable that you might use in your own outreach and for your own work.
yeah, in fact, our project plan is a working paper on a Google Doc that is communicated on Twitter at the hashtag of OA letters. And the open letters that we put out so far are working papers too. We have yet to publish one in an intended audience here. We're still getting that, but those are all under the hashtag OA letters. So
Yeah, and this was one of the things that Sam brought to us too, right? We want to make everything public or publicly workshopped, collectively workshopped. This is in Boston in July. I went and met John and Sam to start bringing things together. That's Leah, the librarian and researcher that also helped us with a lot of our processes. And one of the things that we first realized was that a lot of this project was going to be us figuring out what we were going to do, right? It was really a work in progress.
yeah, we knew we needed advice from people.
Mhm.
None of us were librarians except for Leah, and she was in the Philippines, so our communication with her was more like if she could do certain tasks. But for us, in terms of deciding what the project was, we knew we needed advice.
Mhm.
We didn't want to, in fact, we were really good as a team. The three of us were really very different things we brought to the table.
Mhm.
And one thing I do really well is networking. And so I didn't want to create an advisory board because we didn't know what these letters would look like.
Mhm.
And I think before you'd want to put your name on, we endorse this, you'd want to see one of these letters. And since we didn't know what the letter would look like until we did it, we came up with this concept of secret admirers. So, we've got a good set of a couple dozen secret admirers, and include directors of publishing houses, people who are scholarly communication librarians, library directors, OA advocates. Some of them, you'll see their names because they actually do put comments on some of our project plan or on some of our letters. And even a bibliometrician and some specific scholars too.
Yeah, scholars, heads of scholarly societies. Yeah, John brought together really a group with diverse expertise.
Yeah, it was great.
Yeah, so that was very helpful. So we had them to consult with at every point. And also in this early moment, we established a couple of things to get us started. The first was what kind of tone and message we wanted to employ in our letters in order to kind of get past a lot of the complexity and connect with authors in terms of their own self-interest and what can benefit them and also not be too much of a hassle for them.
So we actually, I had a brainstorm, a lively lunch done 2 years ago at Charleston. Because there's been this idea, I've been working a lot on trying to reach authors through cited sources. And a lot of other projects like that. And one of the questions that was posed 2 years ago at Charleston, if you had the attention, getting the attention of a scholar is important. And that's an important part of this process that we're doing. But if you've got their attention, what are the emotional, I mean, a lot of business, you look at the questions of emotional branding, emotional hook. What's going to be, why are they connected with this? Why are they going to want to be part of what you're trying to do? And so you need to look for things that actually resonate with certain parts of their emotion. And this is done by commercial people all the time when they're selling you soap. But at Charleston, we went through and realized, well, you can use curiosity because academics are curious. And they're especially curious about themselves and how they're doing. And so there's some sense of self-interest about that. They've got a sense of mentoring others. They also eventually have a sense of legacy. They want to make sure their grandchildren will know what they've done. And these can be really powerful motivators in terms of doing something about open access. And then there are a whole set of group norms, like I don't want to be left behind. I know one person who's the head of a library program in a high school, and all the I people have more papers in the repository than the library people do. So she was going back over her resume, and even though she'd been an open access supporter all along, she realized half her own papers weren't in a repository. So that's like complying with a group norm. So these are some of the kinds of things we could use to draw into a letter if we were communicating individually, but also might be elements to a common letter, open letter.
Yeah, exactly. And they also helped us, focusing here helped us do something to avoid being too polemical, overly complicated. We're trying to sort of bring authors who aren't really interested or invested, and even just get them started being conscious about all their publication choices.
Because there had been a suggestion of a comment on one of my blogs that said, gee, why don't we have a wall of shame on Wikipedia for the most cited sources that aren't shared but could be? And we decided shame was not a good one. But instead we wanted to be able to find a list that has some importance to some people so that we can congratulate them for being on that list. Great job. Excellent, you are a model of whatever. And then take that enthusiasm for what great job they've done to say, all right, now let's see how well you've modeled sustainable accessibility.
So this is exactly what we did. And I'll just stop very quickly on this, that we wanted to take sets of resources of various kinds, whether they're in Wikipedia or wherever else, and evaluate, search where their online presence is, and then develop a commentary on the sharing habits and patterns that we saw, and create an open letter or letters, hopefully, as it replicates, and find the right academic channels for those letters, which we're sort of still on that stage. But also, as you can see, consult publicly at all these stages, refine our processes, have people help us make them better, make them adaptable.
So you can see it's iterative and it continually improves because we discover better ways to give Leah the right advice about what to look for, which tools to use, because we'll find another tool that's a little bit better but it has a different blind spot. So all of these things are documented in our process, and then other people who come along will be able to improve it even further.
Yeah, and so the first thing that we ran by our secret admirers, after soliciting input already and going through it ourselves, was this first problem: which lists of works do we want to start with? If we're going to start with one sort of pilot test open letter, 1 or 2 or 3, where do we start?
So I think it's worth just taking a minute and reading these. Can everybody read this in the back? So just read this list of of lists. So one thing you'll notice is that the number of works we're dealing with is small. So it's not, we could do everything manually. We didn't need to have machinery that would sort of like automatically like cover it. And some of these things we could generate from other people's work. So in the Wikimedia world, there's a whole bunch of people doing stuff around citations. And so getting the top cited works, that was something that indeed Sam was able to do, and these others as well. And then in terms of assessing their sustainable accessibility, it was something that Leah was able to do. What she has 50 columns of places where she may have found stuff.
Yes.
She's had 20 years of history as a librarian before she got laid off. And luckily she was looking for work to do, web research work, and she found me, and boy, somebody who knows MARC records.
Yeah.
Yeah, kind of neat.
But yeah, so as you can see, going through them, right, there's a wide variety here. The numbers are small. We're also trying to have different subject coverage, determine what this process might look differently from different angles, from different amounts of resources, from different sort of criteria for, oh, this is something that would be great if it were open, right? Everything from prizes to, urgency and global relevance
And
and so on.
we haven't done yet, and we've done Leah's done her work, but we haven't done yet the malaria one. You can imagine that the malaria one, any discoverability problems, accessibility problems in malaria research, it brings up a lot of questions about the global south, diseases where they are, and people's contribution to those. So we know that'll be a rich one in terms of those kinds of issues. So we really, each one of these is a little different, so.
Exactly. And what we decided to start with, based on our feedback we got from our admirers and others, we decided to go first with this all the citations in a Gates Foundation funded Alzheimer's field review article, which seemed appealing, especially from the perspective of a researcher or reader, reading an article that is mandated to be OA by the funder. But yes, are cited sources then going to be open or closed?
Yeah,
Can they
if you think
keep
about
going?
a survey article, people have different reasons for citing in different content types. So in encyclopedias, you cite just to prove that somebody else agrees with you, that you're not making this up. There's no requirement that it be the best work that you just say, no, this is a fact because university press so-and-so also said it. And when you do a primary research article, you have to cite the people, the shoulders you're standing on and who they were standing on and the people you're hugging and the people whose knees you're kicking in, because you have to sort of show where you are in the chain of knowledge. But a survey article is saying, if you want to understand this subject, I'm an expert, I've studied this stuff, here are the 48 most important things to know. So the funding organization, in this case, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, they want to accelerate research in Alzheimer's. So that's why they funded the research for the survey article. But they'd also want people to be able to read those articles and be up to speed on doing that research. So it inherits this sense of urgency for it to be shared. And that's why it was picked as like, oh, this is a good one because there's an imperative as to why these articles ought to be open as well.
Exactly. So we're going to briefly show you that we also, the second one, which I don't think we'll have time to talk about what we can in the Q&A. Basically just what John already mentioned about the search. It was very capacious. We tried to look as many places as we could, although we did make some active decision points, which others may or may make differently. One of these was to include academic social networking sites like academia.edu and ResearchGate, because we wanted to see what academics were really doing, what were their real sharing patterns.
Yeah, so we didn't choose Sci-Hub because nobody chooses Sci-Hub as their sharing strategy. That's not what's going on. But if you talk to my nephew, who's a professor of comparative literature at Indiana, and you say, is your stuff shared? He says, nobody has trouble getting my stuff. I put it all up on academia.edu. So when when we wanted to be able to, how does a person like that get reached in terms of understanding the sustainable accessibility? And maybe it's a question that academia.edu needs to change some aspect of what they do, or other things need to happen. But Patrick needs to be able to be better educated about what sustainable accessibility means.
Yeah, and we made that one of the target points of our letter. And so here's just a very reduced down from those 50 columns sort of perspective about what we found. The slice of red here is things that are locked behind paywalls completely. We couldn't find any
So actually,
copies.
this surprised me that as much of it was accessible. So like 90% of it's accessible.
Meaning you could find it. You could
It's
find
probably,
it.
it is STEM, it is, it was old enough that it wasn't like behind embargoes at all, because the paper came out, I think, 3 years ago. So, and the green part meaning, yes, sustainably in an archive, but I don't think it surprises anyone here who knows about these things, that a big part of the accessible were all problematic. And indeed, there's probably 50 shades of gray about what
Yeah.
problematic means.
Exactly.
So,
What is problematic?
well, stored on one's own website.
Okay.
Right. The publisher has it available, but it's not clear why or whether it's going to stay there. Right? It's in the social network.
Why is that problematic?
Problematic?
Why is
Yes.
the social network problematic?
Yes, because sustainable accessibility would say that that it's archived, that it's not going to be issued a takedown notice against it. It's going to be reliably open.
But if these lovely social medias, they're in the CLOCKS framework and things like that, so they're archived automatically in a safe and
No, I'm
sustainable
talking about
way.
ResearchGate and academia.edu.
Okay.
Yeah, I didn't mean the open repositories. No, those would be in the green.
Yeah, the academic social networks being a specific related to, especially those two companies.
Good question, I'm glad you asked that.
It's really interesting to see why people call them not appropriate, because everybody uses them.
No, I'm very careful about it. There are
Yeah.
people who call them rogue sites, illegal sites, everything else. I don't take a stand on those questions.
Yeah.
But it is fair to say, you can't know for sure that they're gonna stay open there. So if you are relying on that, my nephew relying on that as a way of sharing his stuff with everybody in the world, he's comparative literature in Latin America. I mean, you don't know if they're gonna be around, because there's dilemmas that may come up. So how big a problem you think it is may vary, but we could have different opinions about that.
Yeah, and to clarify also, the problematic for us in our, again, they're reductive categories in many ways, but we could spend days and days arguing over the little categories. So, we tried to sort of simplify it for the point, but that for us, if you shared, for instance, in a subject repository or an institutional repository, and you post your article on academia.edu, like, that's okay. We're worried about content that is, its only free available copy is on one of these sites that don't have.
These were our choices.
These were our choices,
The
yeah.
thing is there's probably 20 things you could surface about any one of these articles. Does it allow data mining? Does it allow, is the data itself open? And in writing an open letter, you're gonna have to pick 2 or 3, maybe 3 at the most, because otherwise it's too complicated and they're not gonna read your whole article. So, and everybody doing one of these will pick what's important to them, because your audience might be different. If it's internal to a university, and you're doing an open letter about how sustainably accessible are the dean's professional work, go over his resume, and then it's a different dynamic you would have for it, but.
Yeah, and so here, for example, this is one of the things, again, this is our works in progress, this is from a draft that other people commented on, and that the idea being not even so much to critique, although that might be part of it, but to say, author, are you only using academia.edu? Maybe you should think a little harder about something like that. that the process of sharing your content and how you do it is a part of publishing. And it's a part that people don't definitely don't take as much responsibility for and spend time on as actually producing the content, right? So here's...
It's also very common that the feedback we get from one admirer or another is a great letter, it's too long, and you didn't mention these 3 things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, so this is still a working process, and now we've got this out as a working paper, so you can find it on hashtag OA letters. It's a Google Doc, and you can go there and you can add comments to it, help us with this, and share it with others. So, eventually we'll find a proper audience for it. And I'm already working on that networking. It turns out that the daughter of the Minister of Health in China happens to has a job in Boston. So, she's seen this letter. I haven't had a meeting with her yet. I have no idea where that would go. But you'd imagine that Alzheimer's research in China would be a pretty important thing to her daughter.
Yeah.
So.
Absolutely, and I'm gonna breeze past this, just wanted to see the sociology letter that we did, so I wanna make sure we have some more time to discuss. Targeted slightly different things, that we saw more institutional repository depositing, we saw also authors that have, for instance, an institutional policy on OA and a repository but didn't deposit. So this is just to show that there's a diverse range of messaging and targets that you could use. And
about this time that we realized that, we weren't going to call out individual authors.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the reasons is we saw what we'd written. We didn't want to create a punch list for publishers to do takedown notices. And then it turns out that a good number, in the Alzheimer's case, a good number of those articles are in ResearchGate, but they were not put there by their author. So the even worse thing we would want to create is turn authors into cops to beat up their colleagues for why did you put that thing on ResearchGate. So we decided we would only comment in generic ways, but we did want to communicate individually to the authors.
And we'll leave 5 minutes, but we figured out a great way in fact to do this.
I want to say that that we imagine doing this. This is really hard. You have to find out the addresses. You're going to have to communicate with them, and when they send you the wrong thing, you're going to have to explain to them why, that doesn't count as an author. It's accepted manuscript and everything else. That would have been a huge amount of work for us. And we discovered that we could do this entirely with no work on our part at all. We do a bulk load to the OA button. How many of you know what the OA button is? The open access button. All right, so how many of you have heard of unpaywall? So more of you have. So unpaywall finds you green versions that are legal. The OA button, which has been around a little bit longer, and they collaborate with each other. It's a project that's run by Spark in Europe. And what they do is a plugin, and if you hit a paywall of an article, you click on the OA button, and it extracts a story from you. You would like to request the author provide this for what benefit. And their form is that they're able to take that and turn it into a narrative, and they do A/B testing on how they do this, and they find the address. And they have about a 5 to 10% success rate at being able to reach authors and have them get back to them about a version which then goes into an open repository. So they do all of that work of explaining to an author who sends the wrong thing what a right thing would be, of distinguishing between what's a right place to put it and what's not. And they have a spreadsheet that they continually populate so we can see how it's going, and already one of these, the author has responded and it's in process. So that was probably the most success for us, was actually the fact that we discovered we could do this in a seamless way. That means anybody doing a project like this, wow, that's and they can take it at scale. They wouldn't do 10,000, but if you've got 500 or whatever, they can handle it. And so that's probably the best insight that came from all of this.
Yeah, absolutely. And exciting that at least one author has already said, yes, I do want to share.
Yeah. Now, we also found that some publishers weren't quite up to snuff. And by up to snuff, we mean that indeed, we look all up in Sherpa Romeo to see what the rights were and everything else. And either they weren't in, the journal wasn't in there, even though the publisher was. The journal or the publisher weren't in there at all. And in that case, it was a small publisher at a university, and University of North Carolina. But they had won 2 awards in the second letter, the American Sociological Association award winners. They had won 2 awards in that category, and their policies, I looked at their site, and they support the idea of preprints and postprints and so forth being archived and shared, but they probably didn't know about Sherpa Romeo. And I don't know, how many of you know about Sherpa Romeo? Is that? Yeah, so how many of you would show Sherpa Romeo to one of your academics? Right, you wouldn't. But it's really valuable for people doing scholarly communication work to be able to know, repository work for sure, because you want to know what rights are you likely to have that what an author has provided you. So the fact that we had 3 cases where there was a publisher not up to snuff, we emailed them last week and we got responses from all 3. They're checking into it. So that was another nice success out of this.
Yeah, and also shows, again, to sort of close on this point, that letters can have many different kinds of audiences, and they can include publishers, academics, and also that the research process, that if you want to do manually, you can also just have the OA button do it for you, reveals these interesting things, like Sherpa Romeo scores that the letters can cover.
So, does this spawn any ideas in your mind as to where there might be a set of articles that people would like to know? Gee, how accessible are these? How do they measure up? Would that be a way of reaching an audience that you know in your world?
Yeah.
So John, thanks again for inviting me today.
Yeah.
It's great to be here. This is really fantastic. I'm really glad that you're behind Open Access. It's amazing. It's been my first Charleston for a couple of years, and it's obviously open is the big thing, which is amazing. The one thing that I just can't get, why is open all about publishing? Why aren't we thinking about the price of when information is free, what we can do? Isn't that more exciting than going into copyrights and publishing processes?
Well, I can answer that in part from the academic perspective, is that, and I hope this all shifts soon, but the whole higher education apparatus rests on tenure and academic publishing, and so something has to really change in that structure. I think the ideas that you're saying are very exciting, but also, an academic needs to publish in order to have a career.
It's interesting when you looked at your selection criteria, and you just talked about all the challenges of citations. There's different versions and different flavors and different reasons. But you use those as a benchmark for basically deciding on what articles to go after. I mean, you chose probably the best one out of that list, I think. So it's weird, we're talking about publishing a lot and citations to determine good articles, when actually, in a world that's free and open, what does citation matter anymore? I don't know. It's just it's something I'm thinking about a lot.
Well, it's a good question. I think, well, first of all, I'm always motivated by a friend of mine wrote in a book called Are Your Lights On? Whose Problem Is It? If you have a bright idea, if you can't think of 3 things wrong with that idea, you probably haven't thought through the problem well enough. So you're presenting an idea in terms of, gee, if we just didn't have, why do we need even journals, right?
I'm just asking a provocative question. I don't know your point of view.
Yeah.
But
So I think one of the big flies in that ointment is that it's certainly true of family members of mine, which is that academics do seek prestige. And even if there were no tenure requirements for it, because it's a way of measuring. I mean, even Newton sought prestige, right? So it's like it's a matter of sort of it's what drives them in many ways, and they wouldn't be the achievers that they are if they didn't have some sense. And whether that's mechanized the way it is today with citations and the number of publishers and the number of articles you publish and everything else, that's a different question. I think that you could easily say that our system is got a lot of problems in terms of that.
Yeah.
But this basic element of being able to want to have impact and measure that impact in some
Yeah.
way. I
Yeah,
think it's a human trait, though, personally. That's,
but yeah, that's one of the reasons that we had several lists, and impact factor was on like one or two of them, but yeah, we are as someone in the humanities, I think it's
yeah, I'm glad we had multiple
Yeah,
lists. It
but-
turns
yeah.
out that the original idea of doing the Wikipedia thing, the list from Wikipedia of
That's
most
pretty
cited
good, yeah.
sources is interesting, but only on a meta level. Because it turns out what's intriguing about it is that they are all the results of friendly bots that have been set up to make sure that all the stars have the same citation to the star stuff, all the fish have the same citation to the fish stuff, and so there are all these STEM things that come from these bots.
Mhm.
Kind of interesting, but not for very long, and not very instructive in terms of, the people whose articles are in there, and so, and we'll still do an open letter around Wikipedia, but it'll be a very different,
I want to know a little bit more about these letters. So you're writing a letter and you're sending them to the authors of all those papers?
No, here's the thing, what happens, the authors who are any of the problematic ones, they're the ones who get
The
communicated.
OA button.
Your article is not as well shared, sustainably shared as it could be. We're doing an open letter about such and such a domain, and your letter is one of them. I mean, your article is one of them, so we'd like you to make it open. That's what they receive. The article that is the open letter, and they're actually, each one we've got 3 versions of. It'll be sort of like a short one, a really short one, and a longer one. They're the ones that would go into a channel. So an example of a channel is the 15 award winners from the ASA would go into some kind of newsletter at ASA. So because some of these scholarly associations have scholarly communication officers, like MLA, Kathleen Fitzpatrick, she's now at Michigan State, but she's a very well-known open access advocate. So they have an open access initiative in the MLA, and so having this sort of comment on the MLA winners, and that's one of the would be something that maybe they would put in one of their newsletters, or each one might have a different. And I have to say, we're not as far along on placing these letters yet. So.
Yeah, and we had one person remark on our public document, oh, have you thought about doing this with the department? So also it could be, you do a department in your institution and then they're your audience, right? The audience can be whatever size and.
Yeah, that creates that group social norm around it, and it's sort of a motivator,
Yeah, well, we are.
We don't.
I just want to say thank you. If anyone does have to leave, we're happy to stay and answer more questions, but if you have to leave, thank you so much for engaging.
There is a question over there.
Yeah.
There's one
Yeah, I
behind
just
you.
had one quick question. When you had your slide that showed the places you checked to see whether things were open, I noticed that you had archive listed, which is
We had what?
archive,
Yes.
which is typically preprints, not published works.
Right.
That's right, yeah.
I thought at the beginning of your talk, you said you were limiting yourself to looking for open sharing of the published version of record.
Well,
Did I misunderstand?
the subject we'd be looking at would be, the list that we'd be looking at would be published works. But if a preprint exists of that article, that's considered to be green OA. That's actually, one of the ways in which authors can share their
You were counting a preprint as green OA.
preprint or postprint, either one, yeah.
Okay, because not everybody does, but, okay,
I'm sorry?
not everybody does, most people don't.
Redux.
Not everybody does.
But
Yeah, I
everybody
know,
does.
But for your purposes, if it was on archive, you didn't care whether it was preprint, postprint, you just considered that a
As
good
accessible,
sharing,
yeah.
open.
So,
Okay,
indeed, all these decisions, none of us were
Yeah.
librarians, so that's one
Yeah.
thing. I mean, Leah was helpful
Yeah.
to us, but, so indeed, one of the areas where we could could use help in improving the process is what directions to give to Leah or anyone like her. Because there are a lot of issues that come up. I mean, each finding tool you might have will have different blind spots. So like One Finder, which we used for a while, but it avoids ResearchGate, and I think it avoids academia.edu, but not ResearchGate. So each one has its own little blind spot, so you have to have multiple. But we're, I'd say that process needs some real expertise from people who know what they're doing. But we just wanted to see what we could get done quickly, so.
I really like the idea of using the hashtag and Twitter as a way to kind of get engagement. And I was just curious about how that has affected engagement, if there's growth across as you produce more letters.
Yeah, so it hasn't yet, but when you like it and tweet,
Yeah.
that will start it. And indeed, one of our secret admirers, who's a big blog poster in the whole world of ed tech, says he's going to do a blog about all of this.
Good.
And so, no, I think that's the kind of thing that will generate some enthusiasm. And if we'd started this 4 months earlier, we would have then had something to feed into OA week. But then we could pose that, all right, you want to do something neat for OA week, here's a model of what you can do. So maybe next year OA week will have something like this, yeah.
Thank you so much.
There's
Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you.